Hey students, and welcome back to our course on modern philosophy here at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. I am John Studi and Professor, and this week we will be covering Thomas Hobbes. So let's get right to it. Now, Thomas Hobbes is one of the most important philosophers that we're going to cover. Actually, all of them are basically some of the most important philosophers we're going to cover, so I wouldn't teach you anything that's not important, obviously. Just kidding. But Thomas Hobbes does play a crucial role in the history of philosophy, and as we progress through the rest of the semester, you'll see how many of his ideas actually connect to quite a few of the more famous or more important philosophers, such as David Hume, for instance, who is probably the greatest empiricist, or greatest in the empiricist tradition of the modern era, and possibly one of the top 10 most important philosophers in history. You'll see this, and you'll see his influence in basically everybody else as well, either responding to him or in with respect to building upon Hobbes. Now, Hobbes continues this empiricist tradition that we talked about last week, that was kind of initiated or defined by Francis Bacon. Now, remember, empiricist believes that what we know comes through the senses, and there are various levels or various iterations of empiricism in philosophy, but the one that is professed by Francis Bacon and by Thomas Hobbes is a very strict empiricism, because their empiricism is one that really eliminates any knowledge that isn't specifically known in the senses, whereas some forms of empiricism, such as Thomistic empiricism, or Thomistic realism, I guess, says that everything that we know is first known in the senses. Not to say that our senses know everything that our intellect does, but that our senses are these like the transmitters of the truth of the world to our minds, and that our mind can peer beyond and know more than what the senses themselves know, even if the senses might transmit that information. So one way to say this is like for the Thomist, which is also kind of an empiricist philosophy, the senses communicate more than they know in a way that's similar to how a telephone wire communicates a message, but the telephone wire itself does not understand the message. And so our senses are able to present our minds with certain ideas that the senses themselves don't understand, or certain truths that our senses don't particularly understand. Thomas Hobbes, on the other hand, his empiricism is a little bit different. We'll cover that in just a minute here. Now, I also want to remind you real quick that we haven't quite entered modern philosophy, properly speaking, quite yet. Bacon and Hobbes are sort of transitionary figures, and it's not until we get to René Descartes that we enter modern philosophy in the proper historical sense, where we're now entering into a new era. The period of high scholasticism is over, and now we're moving into a new time, a new epoch in the history of philosophy. So let's hop into it. Boom. A little bit about his life. He was born in 1588 in England to an uneducated vicar, who is a vicar is like a priest in the Anglican Church, and he attended Oxford University, where he received an education in scholasticism. Now, scholasticism is sort of a catch-all phrase that describes medieval philosophy as a whole. Sometimes people will take scholasticism just to mean St. Thomas Aquinas, and it seems that some early 20th and late 19th century Christian philosophers took all of scholastic philosophy just to be like high Aristotelian Thomism, and so there's some difficulties at the turn of the century with the Thomism that we find there, although a lot of good stuff too, don't get me wrong. But the reason why it's called scholasticism is that it's a term that indicates how certain philosophical systems were developed in the great universities, and how they were taught in the great universities, especially the University of Paris. In the scholastic system, you'd have a great emphasis on the ability of human reason to help us understand the doctrines of the faith, at least to some degree, as well as the capacity of human reason to demonstrate the preambles of the faith, like the existence of God, the existence of an objective moral law, those sorts of things, and our ability to know such things. Scholasticism also, as a method, had the method of the disputatio, and the disputatio is just what we read in the Summa, where we have a particular question, whether there are three souls in man, or if there's more than one soul. And then it starts off with the objections section, where the author begins If it's a written work, the author begins with objections to his own position, then he gives an argument from authority, then he develops his own unique position, then he replies to those arguments. That was something that was done both in written form but also in spoken form. One of the methods of scholastic dispute was that you had to articulate your opponent's position to their satisfaction before you could actually present your own position and reply to your opponent's position. That way, it kind of helped keep people honest and made sure they could understand their interlocutors' arguments very well, instead of simply responding to straw men. St. Thomas was quite famous for this. In fact, some people were often afraid to debate him because he would frequently articulate certain positions better than those who actually held them themselves, and he would do it more succinctly. And so if you meet somebody who knows your position better than you do, you're kind of in deep water when it comes to a debate. In any case, beyond the methodology and the focus of what medieval scholasticism liked to study, one of the important aspects of scholasticism is that it was heavily influenced by Greek philosophy. Plato was huge. Plotinus and the Neoplatonists were extremely influential. Aristotle, obviously, of course, at the end of the Scholastic era, he was very popular. And these various schools of Greek philosophical thought merged with some of the insights gained throughout the centuries, for one, but also with the Christian faith. And so the truths of the Christian faith helped influence or direct the philosophical direction that people took in their arguments. And now the difficulty with scholasticism was that in the High Middle Ages, or the High Scholastic era, you had some phenomenal authors, great writers: Albert, Aquinas, Bonaventure, those sorts of people, and even slightly after them too. But not long after the death of Aquinas, there was a pretty drastic decline in the quality of their scholarship. That's where you get people like William of Ockham, who's brilliant and came up with something of a mathematicized logical system well before analytic philosophy took root in the 20th century. But their thinking started becoming more about, like we talked about last week, these arid concepts that were detached from reality and failing to recognize when something's distinct in notion but not in reality. For instance, I think the formal distinction of SCOTUS reduces ultimately to a logical distinction, and would, if you look at it in terms of act potency or essence and existence or something like that, we would arrive at something that's akin to the philosophical monism of Parmenides, where everything just is like the same thing. There isn't any dynamism in the world. And so there's some real difficulties that come at the end of the second century, at the end of the High Scholastic era after the death of St. Thomas. William of Ockham, I think, is probably among the worst because of his nominalistic ideas. Anyway, so philosophy after the death of Aquinas, and when it got to the Renaissance and the modern era, became again just concerned with definitions and arid abstractions. It was no longer philosophy, and it was no longer logic that was used as a tool to serve as the way that we go about studying the real world and its causes. But rather, logic became the queen of the sciences. How we think about the world and how we can divide things and how many definitions and distinctions and abstractions and proper formalities can we put together. That became like the height and the goal and the crown of philosophical thinking. But that's just not the case. Logic is only a science insofar as it demonstrates things, and it's a science insofar as it is, well, and that'd be epistemology, because it'd be studying the way humans think. But in any case, logic is really more of a tool. It's something that's applicable to all different sciences, and it helps us think through the conclusions and through the material objects of the various sciences that we might study. And so what this meant was that logic started becoming more of a way to come up with certain axioms by which we interpret the world, rather than developing axioms based on the way the world actually functions. And so there was a bit of a reversal from the Thomistic procedure. And what happens with this is that outside of, if you look from the outside of philosophy, or look into philosophy from the outside, it seems like it's barely anything more than word games. And now this is the education that Thomas Hobbes received. Parsing words, definitions, arid speculation, and really just, again, disconnecting and failing to apply philosophy to the way the world actually functions. What's worse is that Aristotle ceased to be an inspiration to proper thinking and proper investigation of the world, but he was quoted more like a biblical author. So you'd have to memorize certain statements like everything is either pure act or a mixture of actuality and potentiality, which is fine and true and beautiful. Love that kind of stuff. It's a great axiom, great way to think about the world. But if it's just an axiom that you have to memorize, and it's told, and you know it a priori, you don't learn why it's the case that everything has to either be pure act or a mixture of act and potency, then it just seems like a meaningless assertion. There's no grounding in reality. And so if this is how your philosophical system works, which as it's grounded on a series of axioms that are known a priori before any experience or not grounded in the real world, then philosophy really seems like a waste of time. And that kind of philosophy basically is a waste of time. Don't do a priori philosophy. It just isn't going to work out for you. And we'll see why that's the case, especially with that Immanuel Kant, who again is the destroyer of worlds, and one of my favorite philosophers. Not because I agree with what he said, but I think he did philosophy largely well. He ended up in the wrong direction, but he was a good thinker and recognized the consequences of certain philosophical positions. Now, Hobbes hated this kind of education, where he was just subject to the rote memorization of Aristotelian doctrines, and he never really learned or was taught why these phrases apply to the real world, or if they even do, or what they even mean. That wasn't a part of his upbringing. If you teach, this is one thing that's just like obvious. I did 7 years of youth ministry, and if you just shove doctrine on kids, and kids like doctrine, believe it or not, they want to be told what they need to believe about the faith. The problem is you can't just tell them what it is. You have to give them a why, and why it's important, how it applies. And it's the same thing even with my 4-year-old son. If I give him a rule like don't jump on the couch while dad's lifting weights, when my weights are usually right next to the couch, he'll ask because he's 4, and I'll say, well, if you accidentally fall or something along those lines, you're gonna get hurt very badly, and I don't want that to happen to you. So when I'm lifting weights, and this is the best place in the house for me to do it, it's gonna be safest for you if you don't hop on the couch. If you don't give people the whys and the reasoning for the rules or for the axioms or for the ideas that we present them, then they're going to sound meaningless. And this is actually why I think that it's crucial for anybody working in youth ministry or ministry in general to have a solid foundation or a firm grasp on philosophical principles, so that when we offer certain ideas such as the truths about the Catholic faith regarding marriage, or regarding the existence of God or the possibility of divine revelation, it is absolutely essential for us to be able to offer some reason or explanation about why it's necessary or why it's believable, because otherwise it's just a bare assertion, and it's not something that's grounded in reason, and it's not something therefore to respect. It's just another authority telling me something. Now, moving on. Sorry about my little rant there, but Hobbes spent most of his life as a tutor for a prominent family, and he was able to travel around to all sorts of different places, and he actually met Francis Bacon personally, who obviously had a profound impact on him, and also many of René Descartes' colleagues, René Descartes being the father of modern philosophy. And there's some speculation he actually may have met Descartes himself. It's just unclear. Now, unlike like many of the other post-medieval philosophers, Hobbes was hugely influenced by the discovery of Galileo's work, Euclidean geometry, where you have to prove like geometrical figures and facts with absolute certainty. Being able to like line up you draw 3 circles, and if all the radii connect to each other or something like that through the center and the middle, if you draw a line between the points where the circles meet up, you get this absolute perfect triangle or whatever it might be. And so that's how you can prove that a triangle is a triangle, at least one way to do it. But beyond, and Hobbes was absolutely fascinated by this. Geometry became, like I think we talked about last week, sort of the standard of rationality and how you prove something to be true. And we even get this expression today. It's as certain as a geometric proof. Maybe not used so much outside of philosophy, but it's still something that's just sort of in the back of our imagination, is that something demonstrated mathematically is demonstrated with certainty, and there's, I think, some truth to that. But it doesn't mean that other things can't be demonstrated with certainty as well. Hobbes was also heavily influenced by a tragic event, which was the English Civil War, because this was a brutal time in English history, and it actually inspired Hobbes' work, which is called The Leviathan. And because of the English Civil War, Hobbes was forced to flee France. Oopsies, I think I got too far ahead. Yeah, there we go. He was forced to flee France, and he tutored an exiled English prince named Charles II. What a lucky guy. Hey, the monarch has moved to France, and Hobbes gets to tutor Charles II. It's not a bad gig. Now, eventually, he's rejected by the French as something of like the father of all atheism. He's the father of atheists. And this position, at this point, whether Hobbes is actually an atheist or not, is up to debate, because it's not entirely clear if he actually was an atheist. In other cases, his work was really offensive to the Catholic faith in France, or the Catholics in France, and he was eventually expelled from France for more or less hawking heresies about. He made an agreement with Oliver Cromwell, who was functionally the ruler of England at the time, in order to return to England. Eventually, Cromwell and the non-monarchical government were overthrown again, and Charles II was restored to the throne. And even though Hobbes sort of switched sides in the English Civil War, Charles II remembered Hobbes fondly and treated him very well. And this was especially the case since, even though Hobbes had formerly supported Cromwell, after the monarchy was reinstated, he became a very strong supporter of Charles II. There's kind of an interesting back and forth there. All right, now let's move on. Sorry about that. All right, Hobbes' 2 tasks, which were making physics sovereign in philosophy. So he wants physics to rule over everything. And this desire for a universal method was already present in Bacon, who wanted to use the methods of Galileo to successfully predict and control nature. And Hobbes has a similar influence, but instead of with just Galileo's mathematical methods and whatnot, Hobbes wanted to do this with physics, with the science of physics. And he could transfer physics to all of philosophy and science, and he did this in a few different ways. First and foremost, he could do this, or he wanted to do this for a few different reasons. First was Hobbes' materialism, and he said that the concept of spirit is meaningless, because all that you say when you talk about something spiritual is that it isn't matter. And according to Hobbes, that doesn't tell me anything about what it actually is in itself. And Frank Sheet, if you've read his books, Theology Insanity or Theology for Beginners, he begins with a story. I think it's in Theology for Beginners. He begins with a story of somebody preaching in London who talks about spirit. Somebody challenges him about what the definition and meaning of spirit actually is, and he just goes on. He says it's something that the preacher, it's not material. It's not. It doesn't have dimensions. It doesn't exist in space. It doesn't occupy any space. It doesn't do this. So he gives all these negative things, and the person's response was, well, that's the best definition I've heard of nothing in my entire life. Best definition of my entire life I've heard about nothing? I don't know. Anyway, basically the point is, if you can't say anything positive and meaningful about something that you're talking about, yeah, maybe there isn't really any meaning to it. This is exactly what Hobbes said. Hobbes says that Hobbes would ask simply whether we can talk about spiritual being in a meaningful and positive way. All we can say is that it's not matter, but we can't tell you what it actually is. And therefore, spirit is nonsense, because if we can't say anything about it meaningfully, then it has no meaning. If it has no meaning, there is no reality. And so he uses the linguistic analysis of the way that we talk about spirit in order to eliminate spirit from his ontology, which ontology, at least in my definition of the term ontology, isn't the same as metaphysics, but with metaphysics being the study of being qua being, or being insofar as it happens essay or has the act of existence. Ontology is about, like, what are the things within your world? You know, what kind of stuff do you include? Do you include spirit? Do you include different principles? That sort of thing. But so he used this linguistic analysis of the way that we talk about something like spirit, in order to understand or think about the way the world actually is. And his linguistic analysis that reduces metaphysics to, like, its really simple, purely material picture of the world becomes very important later on in modern philosophy, and actually even in modern analytic thought as well. Hobbes' analytic method becomes extremely important for later philosophies, like the philosophies that come out of the Vienna Circle, or from Gottlieb Frege, or Ludwig von Wittgenstein, or A.J. Ayers, or a whole host of other early analytic philosophers, and people who were really interested in the way that we speak about the world and whether or not it actually reveals something about the world itself. Now, we typically use language to interpret what's meaningful in the world, and that results in a much more metaphysically simple picture of the world, according to this way of thinking. Now, following this, since spirit itself is meaningless and God is a spirit, but God is not meaningless, because Hobbes, at the very least, is saying that God exists, then even God must be made of a very fine, imperceptible manner. And because he isn't imperceptible, he's not actually a valid object of philosophical investigation. Because remember, Hobbes is an empiricist. The only thing that we can know about is that which we can study in the senses. Hence, all talk about God should be left to theology. Now, this argument here, it's a little cheap. I mean, certainly it's not going to be the Catholic conception of God, because the Catholic conception of God does not contain any matter. He might find a home in the Mormon faith, because Mormons believe that spirit is a kind of matter, but it's just a very fine and particular small kind of matter. I don't know what that means, but that's what they say. They say that God is actually a material thing, but that's just not the case for the Thomist. But this is also why it's not we're not entirely sure if he's an atheist or not. He's not necessarily denying that God exists, but he's not really affirming the God of the Christian faith. And seems like he was possibly just just trying to appease his contemporaries to avoid further persecution. Now, as I mentioned, Hobbes was an empiricist. And again, since we can't speak meaningfully of anything that we cannot perceive, then we cannot know what we cannot perceive. Makes sense. Hence, if we cannot speak meaningfully about what we cannot perceive via the senses, then we cannot know what we do not perceive from the senses. And so, what we know only comes through the senses. And we only know what does come through the senses. And as already mentioned, Hobbes desired a universal method, similar to the one that Galileo proposed. Galileo's method was so successful in science. Everything's material. And we only know what we perceive through the senses. And so, in order to find a useful method of philosophy, then, but if everything is physical, and physics studies things that are in motion and studies and the science of physics has done a great job of doing things that can help us control and predict the world of material things, then we should, but everything's material, then we should be able to apply these same principles in physics to the other areas of philosophy, like ethics and politics and metaphysics, if you want to call it that, or whatever science you want to describe. So, because his belief that everything is material and that what we can know is only known meaningfully through our senses, and what our senses, and the best way to study senses through physics, then the principles of physics ought to be applied to all other philosophical considerations. Moving on here. So, bodies and motion. So, if we're limited to material things, and physics tells us everything that the world is made up of, then it tells us that bodies are the world is that the entirety of reality is made up of bodies in motion to some extent, which act according to certain deterministic causal laws. Then physics is going to be great for our philosophical pursuits. Now, for Hobbes, the meaning of laws of nature are things like, rocks fall because of gravity, and so it's this cause, it's this regularity that we see, or we see that setting a tree on fire causes the tree to burn, and these laws operate always and without variation, and it's true of all things. Natural bodies such as trees and stones will always act according to certain principles. You drop a rock, it goes down towards the ground. You throw a rock at a window, the window is going to break. You set a tree on fire, it's going to burn up and turn to ash. And also artificial bodies, like even political bodies, so society. So for Hobbes, and we'll talk about this in a moment here, a human is just a deterministic machine. If you had a calculator a computer that was powerful enough, it could calculate, your mass, your atomic makeup, all the different things that went into you, making you up to this point, and could predict later on what you're going to do. And since you yourself are a machine, when you throw a bunch of these machines together, what you have is this machine, this organization of machines. And if you get the math right, then you're going to be able to figure out the best way to run this machine, which would be like a society. Because since everything is matter in motion, then even communities of persons are instances of matter in motion, and these communities will likewise behave according to certain deterministic laws of nature. And so, if even these bodies, both are human bodies, individually and collectively as a society, operate only according to deterministic laws of nature, what becomes a free will? There is no free will. You can't have free will. You're as free as a computer is to operate according to the input that's given to it. You're just going to be the cogs moving together and the tumblers falling into place based on the stimuli of the outside world, and everything that is known, everything that is going to happen, every choice that you make. Well, it's in itself predictable, even if we can't predict it ourselves. Now, when it comes to Bacon's philosophy of science, when it comes to Newton's philosophy of science, I want to contrast it with a little bit with Aquinas' three major theoretical sciences. And theoretical sciences are ones wherein we study truth for its own sake, and he divided it according to physics, which studies being in motion, mathematics, which studies being insofar as it's quantifiable, insofar as we can assign a number to it. And he also studied, and he also said the final science and the highest science for St. Thomas is metaphysics, which studies being insofar as it is being, and the distinguishing characteristic, or the formal object here, is that it's being insofar as it Hobbes' essay has the act of existence, and studying everything else about it in light of its act of existence as the act of all acts. And this is what St. Thomas calls first philosophy, because it examines the most fundamental and foundational principles of all reality, and all their perfections flow from the metaphysical truths that we discover within that science, first philosophy. For fairly simple reasons. Whenever we have whatever characteristic you find in mathematical principles or in the world, if you're studying, how fast a car is going, well, if that car didn't exist, then there would be no numbers to put into a calculator in order to figure out its velocity. Or if you're studying other aspects of physics, like how is it that form and matter operate or work with one another, if neither the form nor matter existed at all, then we wouldn't have a science of physics. And so metaphysics studies being insofar as it has essay, and then studies everything else in light of that essay, including individuals, materiality, and formality and whatnot. But the other sciences depend upon the conclusions already established by metaphysics, and that metaphysics demonstrates the beginning points of certain things, like in physics. You start with the assumption that things have natures, and you prove that, you demonstrate that in metaphysics. Anyway, so those are St. Thomas's three sciences, and you guys should have a fairly solid grasp on that in general already. I think many of you have taken medieval philosophy and metaphysics, and natural philosophy for that matter. But Hobbes has four sciences, and the four sciences are first, philosophy, and this actually replaces metaphysics. Get the right slide here. Oh, am I missing something? I may be missing a slide. That's okay. First, philosophy, and this actually replaces metaphysics, and it's actually going to be physics. So the Thomist, again, describes metaphysics according to the principles that are common to all being, which would pertain to both immaterial and material being. But for Bacon, he just rules out any talk of immaterial being, and therefore the first philosophy is going to look at the laws and the science which studies the principles of physical things, or those things which are governing bodies. And so he would be studying the general causal laws governing all bodies, and this would be in physics. And so he replaces metaphysics with physics because there's nothing immaterial, and since now physics is the highest science, then physics is first philosophy. He also has the special sciences, and this would include things like astronomy or physics, because it pertains to the motions of particular bodies. We're kind of moving in a genus-species order here. So you have physics up at the top, which studies things in motion, and then you say, okay, the special sciences. All right, we got the special sciences, astronomy, stars and planets in motion, or mathematical physics, things in motion insofar as they're quantifiable. And so he uses these distinctions, he uses these distinctions to talk about the ways in which we can study different things in motion according to the particular kind of motion that they have, like chemistry, and how things are composed of certain elements, or biology, how some things are alive, or the stars, so on and so forth. He also has the science of human bodies, and this science asks questions like, how do these causal laws affect human bodies, or how are human bodies in motion? Because according to Hobbes, again, human bodies are like machines. Our bodies are just arranged like a clock or a car. There's no intrinsic nature or intrinsic purpose to them. There's no final cause, there is no formal cause. It's just atoms floating in the void that happen to be arranged John-wise, or arranged Chris-wise, or whatever else it might be. Now, let's recall something here. Modern philosophers subscribe to what's called a mechanistic metaphysics. And so the way that they understand the world is that it operates just like a machine. Even natural things like trees or squirrels or grass. And that there is, again, no principle of unity or motion in a body. Or final causality. The parts of my body are not united by nature or substantial form, but are just accidentally forced together like a car, like how the car's parts are forced together. This is not how Aquinas understood things, which I'm sure you guys are already aware of. And lastly, we have the science of political bodies. Again, we're looking at how human communities relate to one another. And we discover the laws governing the motion of human bodies, what makes a person act in a certain way. And we also use these same laws to understand how we ought to govern individuals and bring about peace and order in a society of individuals living in a community. Let's talk a little bit about Hobbes' physics of knowledge. How do we know things? And so for Hobbes, we have the motion of objects in the world relate to our senses insofar as they cause or create sensations in us. There are things in the world, energy drinks, books, onions cooking on the stove upstairs, whatever else it might be, and they're all simply bodies in motion. These act on our sense organs, which create in us something called phantasms. Honestly, so far so good. Motions of objects in the world create these sensations called phantasms. Okay, phantasms are the individual sense object, but in our minds. And so you have like a picture of, when I think about my son, I have a picture of my son in my mind. My son himself, the physical individual upstairs, isn't like in my brain. That would be horrible. But I have an image of my son. And so Aquinas here and Hobbes are actually relatively close to one another, but they differ more severely in the next point. So remember, there's a difference between primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities are things like dimension or weight. They're quantifiable somehow. You can throw them into an equation. Primary qualities are things that exist in the real world. You can measure something. You can weigh it. You can see how fast it's moving. Secondary qualities, on the other hand, are how we perceive and subjectively experience things that do not exist and these things do not exist in the real world. It's just the geometrical particles in the soup that make me think that it's hot, or that it's tomato soup, or that it's tasty, or whatever else it might be. And these things don't exist in my mind. Deliciousness doesn't exist in tomato soup. I dispute that. I love tomato soup. One of my favorite meal is literally just grilled cheese and tomato soup, especially the roasted red pepper tomato soup, organic roasted red pepper tomato soup from Trader Joe's. Delicious. But, according to Hobbes, this is just in my mind, doesn't exist in the real world. Now, Hobbes agrees with this general modern conception. Secondary qualities are just intensely qualitative rather than are just intensely qualitative rather than quantitative, and so they don't actually reflect the real world. What that means is that the phantasms, the picture I have in my mind, is something that is a secondary quality. It's not something that's actually existing out there, and so it doesn't accurately reflect the real world of primary qualities. But this leads to a problem. How do we know the real world at all? If what we know is something that's simply qualitative, but the real world is quantitative, then how is it that our qualitative idea connects properly or maps on accurately to the quantitative world of reality? That's a problem. If what I know is the phantasm, but the phantasm does not reflect what is real in the world, then how can I have any knowledge about the world at all? Now, this is going to come up again and again through the rest of modern philosophy, and honestly, we still feel the effects of Hobbes and skeptical and empirical skepticism in our own day. Do I know the real world, or do I only know the images in my mind, and are my ideas first? I don't know. If the latter two, then I'm simply trapped in my mind. I fall, and I know that there are these internal ideas about how I fell, but it's hard to see that I fell in reality. And it's hard to see how I know the real world at all. Now, this is especially true if the phantasm is, again, purely qualitative, and the world is really quantitative, because there's no alignment between my ideas and reality. And so it seemed like they are, in fact, contrary opposites. So my ideas are the exact opposite of whatever the world actually is. And this eventually becomes a philosophy called idealism, where what we know is limited only to what we experience, only to what we, where reality is only limited to what we know. Now, according to Hobbes, thinking is nothing more than the motions produced by the phantasms and the motions that these phantasms produce. So memory and imagination would be merely weak and fading copies of sense experiences under this conception. And these are going to be much weaker than my immediate sense apprehension. So if I'm eating an apple, it's quite obvious what the apple tastes like to me. But when I think about eating an apple, the idea is there, but the longer I go without eating an apple, the more I forget it. And the use of imagination for Hobbes, where we kind of come up with these images and think and remember and recollect and put things together, it allows us to create. It allows us to put different ideas together to make a new idea. And so this would be like you'd be adding or subtracting images ultimately. So which is how we can get like a griffin, where you take an eagle face, a lion body, and wings, or you get a unicorn by adding a horse and a horn, and you put wings on it. It becomes an alicorn. So for Hobbes, the imagination is to help us create new ideas based off prior sense experiences and just putting them together. Now, what about our causal reasoning? Well, I think that when I see lightning, it causes the sound of thunder. But is this true? Well, Hobbes says that we don't actually have any special insight into reality with respect to cause and effect, but rather that we're trained to follow certain events, to expect that certain events follow others, sort of like Pavlov's dogs, who associate food with bell. So if you don't remember the experiment, this guy, Pavlov, is a scientist. He would ring a bell, and every time he'd ring the bell, he'd feed the dogs food, and then after a little while, whenever he'd read the bell, the dogs would start salivating because they're anticipating a meal. And so in the same way, when we think about cause and effect, what we see that there's this association between certain events like thunder and lightning that go together. But for Hobbes, we're not actually peering into the causal reality of the world. It's not lightning that's causing thunder to happen, but it's just an association we make. It's the same thing. We don't actually know if a fire causes a tree to become ash by burning it as an efficient cause. We just associate the two together. And so now, obviously, this sounds strange, and we're going to talk about this more in depth when we address Hume, because this is one of Hume's most famous ideas, which is that cause and effect aren't something in the real world, but rather it's just our association of ideas. So cause and effect are loose and separate. Now, we also had so this would be like an association psychology. So like animals, our minds associate various sense phenomena or experiences which often accompany one another. And so we expect thunder whenever we see lightning. Now, it's going to be important, again, later on in this course. All right, let's hop on here. So if we're just matter and motion, if we're just imagination, sense, memory, and association, what distinguishes us from animals? Animals can do all those things. Well, for Hobbes, it can't be a spiritual soul because there's no such thing as a spiritual soul. And so what he points to is language. Now, language is different. Language for Hobbes is not a quantitative difference. There isn't a quantitative difference between animal speech or animal communication and human communication. It's a qualitative difference. Now, I'm using this term kind of in this scholastic sense. And so it's not just like we're adding a more and more complicated way of speaking or way of communicating when we get to humans. If an animal just progresses for long enough, that they're going to accomplish the same linguistic development that we have. Rather, it's qualitative. It's totally different. So with animals, they associate certain sounds with certain ideas, like a white-tailed deer. It lifts up its tail, and that tells the rest of the herd that there's danger nearby, and so everybody runs away. But when it comes to humans, we associate symbols with ideas in a way that animals can't. And we also associate, and Aristotle points this out in the Prior Analytics, where he says that that one of the differences between humans and animals is that animals just kind of communicate well enough for the present moment. But humans, what we do is we actually write things down for future generations, and we can learn things from the past because of the way that we've learned to communicate through writing, and now through recording as well. And this is what makes us human. As humans, we use words that have we have used words that have sounds that are universally applicable. When I say man, it's universally applicable, even if the term man is different. I could say hombre in Spanish, or man in English, and it means the same thing, but the sound is different. And so the meaning is contained in two particular material instances, either hombre or man. It's the same thing with other words like dog or cat or dog, perro, cat, gato, so on and so forth. Now, one of the major issues in the history of philosophy, speaking of this universality and oneness, one of the major issues in the history of philosophy is the dispute between realism and nominalism. The realist, like Plato, says that for every kind of thing, like this would be a radical realist, for every kind of thing there is a universal exemplar in the realm of ideas, that all other things in existence, or everything of that particular kind, merely imitate according to one degree or another. So for Plato, there'd be a dog, Fido, but the thing is, Fido is just an imperfect example of what the true form of what it means to be a dog. Nominalists, on the other hand, believe it's the exact opposite. That the words that we use to represent universal ideas are just that. They're just words. There's only individuals. You find Lassie, you find Fido, but you don't find dog anywhere. In fact, some nominalists go so far as to say that there is no such thing as dog nature, and that Fido and Lassie don't actually share anything together beyond some arbitrary physical similarity. So why is it that we refer to them as dogs? Well, it's because, just honestly, it's for arbitrary and practical reasons. We see three animals that look very similar, but instead of listing each of the minuscule differences, we can just group them together. All right, that's good enough. All right, they've got 4 legs, these kind of teeth, they have this kind of snout, they act this way. All right, let's call them all dogs. Great. We might be able to expand or contract this boundary at some point, but hey, it's good enough for now. It just simply saves us time, helps us communicate. But there simply is no real common nature, according to nominalists. Hobbes being one of those. And there's no common nature between the various members of this arbitrary group: dogs, humans, cats, trees. Sure, I could have grouped things differently so that cats and dogs are lumped together, but it seemed like there were enough differences to keep them in separate groups. So we could maybe make a bigger group. Quadrupeds, and quadruped mammals, and other quadruped mammals. And this is just, we're just naming things here. We can include dogs. But these terms are just names that are convenient and good enough for the similarities. And so, Hobbes was a nominalist. When a nominalist says that there are no universals in the world, these are only names, nomina, that we use to describe objects that are similar. But how does this relate to our use of reason? Well, nominalism actually has some very serious consequences for our ability to reason. Now, remember, when we talk about our reasoning, we go through a process of abstracting the universal, making judgment, bringing it back to the individual, and then once we have, and that's crowned by something. The act of judgment is crowned by by the formation of the proposition, which takes the form of X is Y, or like all S is P, or whatever it might be. And that's proposition. Then you put those two propositions and you compare them together, so you get something like the Socrates syllogism: all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Great, follows logically, love it, it's beautiful. Now the problem here is that we can see this. It makes total sense on some form of realism. Moderate realism, like St. Thomas's, or even like a very extreme realism like Plato's. We can say, all animals have a body, right? And all bodies are subject to decay. And all rational animals are animals. And Socrates is a rational animal. Therefore, Socrates has a body, and his body is subject to decay, and everything's subject to decay, if it's alive, is subject to death. So, Socrates is mortal. Makes total sense. We can see these essential features which apply to all those sorts of things that they all share in common: the mortality, their ability to all animals having bodies, and so on and so forth. But if, as the nominalist proposes, all of our definitions are arbitrary, then every single one of our logical syllogisms fall apart, because our reasoning becomes purely subjective and arbitrary, and there's no way that we can actually access the reality that we're talking about, and that we're trying to make an argument for. And so we can't discover reality. All we can do is discover the consequences of certain definitions and boundaries that we've set for the things in the world. Now, reasoning won't tell me about reality itself, but only the subjectively outlined definitions that I've given it. So it's impossible for us, nominalism, to discover the nature of reality, even for science. And reason provides conclusions about the consequences of our subjectively chosen definitions. Okay, so we've talked enough about how Hobbes wants to apply physics to all of reality. So let's see how that impacts his understanding of the human being. All right, we've mentioned before that Hobbes is deterministic in his metaphysics. And what this means is that everything in the world, since everything in the world is made up of matter and motion, and matter and motion is governed by the deterministic laws of physics, then if we had enough computing power, we could analyze all the various variables all the way back to the beginning of the universe and predict perfectly everything that plays out from that point on. Nothing is contingent. Therefore, everything's determined. So, if everything is determined, nothing is contingent. What does this mean for human beings? Well, exactly the same thing. According to Hobbes, if we can study and understand the motions of the human body and brain, then we are able to perfectly predict human actions. So what does this do for free will? Well, it completely destroys it. We are simply matter in motion. You are not John. You are not Chris. You are not Diego. You are not whoever you are. You are a blob of atoms floating in the void who we happen to name you. To kind of quote I think C.S. Lewis says that in the Book of Miracles. But in any case, we're simply matter in motion. We act according to deterministic laws, and therefore we have no free choice. And so human actions are deterministic, and it's just complicated motion. And the more we study these complicated motions, the better we are able to predict human behavior. Now, Hobbes divides human motions into, not as motions, so human action or human motions, into two kinds: vital motions and voluntary motions. So vital motions are automatic, like the blood pumping the heart, or neurons, how your neurons work in your brain. They're gonna work no matter what you want to do with them, or your skin shedding, or scabs healing over, your heart beating, and so on and so forth. These are things that happen automatically. His second category is voluntary motions. Now, don't be tricked by the term voluntary here. Hobbes doesn't actually believe in free will. Free will is just more complex motions. And it kind of sounds like actually Samuel Harris, who said that, if you look at some of the things that he says about free will, he thinks that free will is nothing more than our inability to predict the outcome of human choices with mathematical precision. So it's more on the level of ignorance rather than on the level of the way things are in reality. And so we have so free will is just a complex motion. So we respond to a certain stimuli with some sort of aversion. I have a desire to take a nap. I hate celery. It ruins everything that it touches. Oh my gosh, I hate celery. And so on. So we have all these various things that stimulate our desires or our aversions. And now that's the very first part of it. So something stimulates us. And sometimes we have stimulations that, go one way or the other. I want to take a nap, but I also have to work. And I might not want to work or exercise or do schoolwork with my son. But at the same time, I know those things are also going to be good in the long run for various reasons. And so here we actually have to start entering into the process of deliberation, as Hobbes calls it, which is simply the complex web of motions between competing desires and aversions. We can kind of think about it this way. When you go into the gym. So I have a desire to go to the gym insofar as I want to be in better shape, be in good health, have a good sense of self-mastery, be strong and skilled enough to defend myself if I need to, that kind of thing. But there's also an aversion. Cardio sometimes sucks. Weightlifting can be hard. When you are doing a really hard sparring session or something like that, you start you get the feeling of burnout, and your lactic acid starts building up, and your legs are heavy, and your arms are heavy, and you're having to defend punches and kicks, and you get hit in the head. This kind of thing is awful. But on the other end, if I don't learn those sorts of things, then if it ever comes down to a situation where I have to defend myself and it really matters, I'm not going to have the experience or the stamina to actually defend myself. Okay, so and that's also something important for me. And I enjoy, but on the other hand, I really enjoy the results of working out in general and the friends that I make. It's just a lot of different emotions going on here, and they're all in competition with one another. And this is simply what Hobbes calls determination. So whichever desire or aversion is going to be the victor leads to the final part of human motions or human action, which is the act of the will. And that's simply the victor, which is going to be the stronger of the desires or aversions, or like the team of desires and aversions to make a particular decision. If my desire for napping wins out, then it's nap time. Woohoo! If my desire to go to the gym and get them gains is the strongest, then hit the gym. Now, whatever the strongest desire turns out to be, that's going to be the decision that we make. There's no spiritual consideration of various ends or ultimate goals. It's just the desires wrestling with one another. And it's not something that arises out of our own free will, and that could have been different if we were placed in those exact same circumstances again. But these desires are just materialistically determined, and everything that's materialistically determined is not free because they simply operate to deterministic laws. And so, both the vital human actions and voluntary human motions are deterministic and governed by the laws of physics. And so if you don't have any free will, how in the world does ethics work in Hobbes' system? So if everything is determined by our feelings, then that is the direction that our ethics has to go. Good. Good is that which we desire because it makes us feel good somehow. Evil. Evil is that towards which we have or feel an aversion because it makes us feel bad. We don't like it. So Hobbes' ethics becomes entirely hedonistic and subjective. There's no question of ought. There's no moral obligation. You just do whatever you feel strongest about, and that's what you're going to pursue. Now, if this is true, how in the world could we possibly live harmoniously? We have all these competing desires and feelings and concepts about what we desire in the hierarchy of these things which are good or detestable or desirable. This is a real problem. So how does he help us deal with this? Well, he tries to solve this in his political philosophy, which is for him just the physics of political bodies, the way people act in concert together. His solution is to address these problems as if human societies were sort of like a constellation of stars or a solar system, which in and of themselves are made up of otherwise individual parts, each of which are deterministic in their own right. But when they're acting in concert together, the whole is also determined, but in relation to one another. And so, if we can, in the same way, if we understand the physics of the way the solar system works, then we can accurately predict the way that certain meteors are going to be passing through our through or past Earth's atmosphere or whatever it might be. We can also, if we understand the physics of the political body, city, a family, a country, a nation, a world, then we can actually erect a new and flourishing society because we're now able to predict and control the way that it works. So the physics of the political bodies. All right, now we're going to discuss this relatively quickly. So first, we need to discuss the fact that Hobbes lived through the English Civil War, and he switched sides several times. First he was on the side of Cromwell, then he was on the side of, first he was on the side of the king, then he was on the side of Cromwell, then the king again, and he got pretty lucky with this. And every time he did, he was basically a traitor. And traitors are usually executed, even in our own day. If you are guilty of treason, you die. And after finding his head on the chopping block more than a few times, Hobbes learned a few things. First, Hobbes learned that the lack of a stable government results in chaos. And it's true. If you've ever taken care of teenagers and let them just kind of like rule the roost for an hour, you'll find a lot of things get destroyed pretty quickly. And there's a lot of rules which are formally followed violated. Same thing with 4-year-olds. If you tell a bunch of 4-year-olds to go play on the playground, it's absolute chaos. What's easy is that you can just like do a game, and as long as you're moderately entertaining, they follow you around. But in a society, few people are going to live well. You're going to be trying to take what especially considering Hobbes's understanding that that man is by nature. We'll talk about that next. So anyway, for Hobbes, chaos is something that we do not want. The terrible consequences of war. There's bombs going off everywhere. People are being shot. Truth is always the first casualty in war. There's deception. There are people who are betraying one another, and so on and so forth. War is hell. And for Hobbes, chaos is only prevented if the government itself is strong. And so he writes about this in his book, Leviathan. And in Leviathan, he says that like the physicist studies the laws of physical motion, we have to also study the laws of human motions, human behaviors. And if we do, we can construct a society that is beneficial for men. He also attempts to approach this problem according to the perfectly demonstrative method of geometry. Now, what is this Leviathan? What is this project? So, if you remember, the Leviathan comes from the book of Job, and we're not precisely what Leviathan is, but we know it's a huge beast, and the book of Job talks about it being this huge beast that's more powerful than anything else on earth, and that God himself can control it and wrangle it. Great. Now, I'm not going to go into what it means in the book of Job. It's not necessarily relevant to our current discussion, but for Hume's, when he thinks about humanity, or sorry, not Hume, for Hobbes, when he thinks about humanity, he says that the state of human nature, what's natural for human beings, would be whatever we would find human beings doing, absence any government. So if each human being, abstractly considered, is living in a zone, he would actually have no obligations to anyone. No community to family, no obligations to society, no rule of government. So he's entirely free. In fact, he has the right to do whatever he pleases. As long as there's no one to stop you and you don't get in anyone else's way, go right ahead. Interestingly, most modern philosophers now see man as a naturally solitary animal, which is the exact opposite of scholastic thought. We'll talk about that in the lecture tomorrow. So what would it be like to live in the absence of government? Well, again, there'd be no obligations whatsoever. We'd have the absolute freedom to do as we please. The right to do whatever we want. Now, remember, ethics is subjective for Hobbes. So whatever is good for you is going to be good for you. But there's an undesirable consequence. Because, remember, we're bodies in motion. And we are bodies in motion driven by nothing but a desire for our own ends. Pure egoism. Altruism is not a natural emotion. It's something that's forced upon us. We are nothing but desires acting in motion. Again, we're ultimately just egoists. We're just self-interested. We're looking out what's good for us. So desiring the good for others for their own sake is just strange and unnatural, foreign. So naturally we want to work for ourselves, but it's unnatural for us to want the best for others. And so what's the result of taking this sort of view? Well, it's a frightening world. Human beings attacking, killing, stealing from one another. The natural emotion would be fear. You can't live a good life if you're constantly waiting at your door with a spear. Now, desiring and working towards the good of others is something contrary to the way we are. Hobbes is not actually suggesting here, you should know, that human beings ever actually live this way, all by themselves. He's just considering man in the abstract, like what would it be like if we had no community or obligations of any sort. So, for Hobbes, the natural laws are not like the natural laws of St. Thomas, but they're talking about what would be man in the state of nature, abstracted from a political body. And this is how he describes human beings in this deterministic world. He would say that human beings are merely free to govern, that the laws of physics govern human bodies in the same way they govern all bodies. And so, so he has a few laws of how human bodies work. The first law is I want to survive. Therefore, I ought to do the things I need to survive, and I will do the things I need to survive. And if we want to live and govern our life well, then here's what we have to do. One ought to seek peace and follow it, or failing that, be prepared to defend oneself by any means necessary. Second law is that it's entirely impossible to ensure one's survival on one's own. No matter how powerful you become, someone could always become more powerful and overthrow you. So we seek peace for the sake of survival, but in order to do so, one ought to give up all individual rights, provided that everyone else does so as well. If we can't do what we want but are ruled by someone else, then we're not going to see competing goals. Our goals are directed by the despot. But the only way to do this is to have a very, very powerful and ultimately despotic government. Now, the power of the government is the power of the Leviathan. This is the beast. And in order to ensure that we all follow this selfish golden rule, we need a coercive power, which is why I said it's despotic. A despot is somebody who rules by fear. And now the people in the society agree to give up all of their rights to the government, which Hobbes calls that mortal god. He says this because people give absolute authority and absolute power to the government. This is everything. We do this because we want to survive. And since that aim really overrides all others, we find ourselves more than happy in many times to simply relinquish our total autonomy for the sake of our survival. And this gives rise to what's called the social contract. Now, many, if not all, modern philosophers, and even in our own time, propose some sort of social contract because, again, none of us are naturally altruistic, and so we come up with a social contract, which is the agreement by which the people of a society agree to accept the state of nature by surrendering all of the rights to some sort of sovereign authority. Now, again, this isn't a literal historical event. There wasn't just like a bunch of people randomly living out somewhere in the world, and then came together to form a society. But rather, we agree to the social contract as long as we are living in a given community. We just always happen to find ourselves living in community. Now, there might be some weird people who kind of like travel the world and feel like and renounce all citizenships, and then maybe they're living in something closer to the state of nature, according to Hobbes. But really, they wouldn't be. Ultimately, if we're living in any state, then we'd have to wake up to a different set of agreements. My state of nature is something that I give up to the society, from whom I'm benefiting, and we would leave the social contract by we could simply leave the social contract, but by simply benefiting from the law and order, we commit ourselves to whatever government we happen to be a part of, whether it be a monarchy, a democracy, despotism, dictatorship, whatever. So this has an unsurprising conclusion. Well, actually, I don't really think it's surprising at all. Given that Hobbes has some experience with the devastating effects of a weak government in the English Civil War, it's entirely expected that he might be an absolutist in regard to political authority. He saw political weakness as the cause for all this suffering and death, and so he blames that. So it's a very common human trait to jump to the other end of things. Anything seems better than the madness that he lived through. However, I wonder how his views would have been if he lived through the horrors of the 20th century in the absolutist regimes, or if you looked at North Korea today and how their people are starving. It's a very strong government with a relatively powerful military, but it is a horrible place to live. We still see this kind of absolutist government, and it leads to nothing but massive death and chaos. I wonder how Hobbes would have approached these sort of governments. Just something to ponder. So that's enough for now. In tomorrow's lecture, we're going to talk about how a Thomist might respond to some of the things that Hobbes says. And in particular, I'm going to focus more on the metaphysical issues, because that's my area of specialization. All right. Thank you. God bless, and I hope to see you guys in the forums.